Hello and welcome back to the channel. We talk horror here. If that's something you enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm doing things with my hands. I'm wearing a shirt with wolves on it because today is laundry day. This is all kinds of bad. Today we're doing 10 underrated horror films from 2023. We're nearing the end of the year. I'm recording this on December 7th. I have gathered 10 films I would consider to be hidden gems that I like a whole bunch. Only one of them was released theatrically, but even that one had like a limited release, and I think it's quite underrated, so I'm quite comfortable using the term hidden gems. Let's start off with one of my favorite films of the year, Influencer. It comes from the director of Spiral, not that Saw film with Chris Rock, but the Shudder original that dropped a couple of years back. I really enjoyed that film, so I was pretty excited to see Influencer, and it did not let me down. This is a difficult movie to talk about because it doesn't really show its hand up until like 30 minutes in, and it's actually at that point you get a very late title card, which I thought was a fun detail. But essentially, this is about a pretty successful Instagram model slash influencer named Madison, who is at this gorgeous retreat in Thailand. She was supposed to be there with her boyfriend, but we find out that they had some relationship troubles, so she ended up going on this trip alone. At the retreat, she meets this other girl called CW, who really is the star of the show here. I have a feeling we'll be seeing a lot more of Cassandra No, who plays CW in the future. On paper, this is the type of performance we've seen before. The two comparisons that come to my head immediately are Kathy Bates in Misery and Aubrey Plaza in Ingrid Goes West. But both of those performances are more rooted in obsession. In Influencer, it really feels like CW is motivated by jealousy more than anything. And jealousy is one of those really ugly feelings that really brings out the worst in people, and I think Cassandra No captures this perfectly. I also think this movie has a very interesting structure where each of the three acts follows a different character. This works in the movie's favor since they're slowly peeling back the layers of the story. It also works as a little bit of a reset because every 30 minutes or so at the end of each act, something completely bonkers happens. So you get a little bit of a relief as you're introduced to a new perspective with the start of each act. I had a really good time with this film, and there's actually a surprising amount of gore and violence as well, so it's entertaining from that aspect too. Like with all these types of films, there is a point towards the end where you have to sort of suspend your disbelief a little bit, but overall, I think this is a very smart horror thriller. Cobweb is kind of similar to Influencer because it's another one of these movies that kind of shifts every 20 or 30 minutes or so to keep the audience guessing. This is the only film on the list that had a theatrical release, but as I said in the beginning, it was limited, and it was completely buried due to it opening next to Oppenheimer and Barbie. Lionsgate, who distributed this movie, already had Saw X slated for October, so I understand why they didn't put it out as competition with that movie, because that's like cannibalizing your own market, but I think the timing is super unfortunate because this would have been a really fun Halloween movie. Most of the movie is actually set on Halloween. The setup is kind of similar to Scott Derrickson's The Black Phone, where you have this kid who is hearing voices from the walls in his bedroom. His parents are played by Lizzie Kaplan and Sebastian Starr, and they are both completely off of their rockers in different ways. So in the beginning, you're not really sure if there's something supernatural going on or if this kid has created an imaginary friend to kind of cope with some of the things that is happening in his life. While the setup reminded me of The Black Phone, the film itself is actually way more similar to James Wan's Malignant. Because just like Malignant, this film is completely bonkers, and I absolutely love it. The last 20 minutes of this movie is essentially a gory action movie, and I think that threw some of the reviewers off, but I could very much see this becoming a cult classic for horror fans. I also want to give a shout out to Lizzie Kaplan, who is amazing at playing these really unhinged roles where she gets to chew the scenery a little bit. The only negative thing I have to say about this movie is that it maybe moves a little too fast at times. It's a 90-minute movie with some pretty heavy tonal shifts, so if some of these moments were allowed to breathe a little more, I think the movie would have gotten a lot better reviews. But even so, I think it's incredibly entertaining and well worth watching. The Passenger is directed by Carter Smith, who has done one of my favorite body horror films from the 2000s, The Ruins. He actually had 2 movies released this year, the other one being Swallowed, which I thought was okay, but The Passenger is definitely the one I want to highlight for this video. The film starts with a workplace shooting at a diner where one of the servers, Benson, sees another coworker being bullied, and that makes him snap. He goes out to his car, grabs a shotgun, and kills everybody except for the guy who was being bullied, a 19-year-old named Bradley, who is actually our main character. The rest of the film turns into a road movie where Benson takes Bradley on various excursions to make him be able to stand up for himself. And the interesting thing about this film is that even early on, Benson actually succeeds in doing this. The ends obviously don't justify the means, but I think this movie has some very interesting things to say about trauma and how you can go through a really terrible experience and come out the other end of it as a better person. I'm not trying to argue that this movie's message is that trauma is necessary for you to grow as a person. Like, that's not what they're getting at. It's more about perseverance and the fact that you never quite know where life is going to take you. It's interesting to have a movie like this that is quite gory and violent at times, to also have this kind of uplifting message, and I think it's refreshing because lately there's been so many horror movies, exploring trauma, and there's a conversation near the end of this film where Bradley talks to someone who he thinks he's wronged in his life. He wants to apologize to this person. And it's legitimately one of the most heartfelt scenes I've seen all year. And it's a really interesting, introspective conversation about trauma in the middle of this, road horror movie. I also have to say that Kyle Gallner, who plays Benson, is great as this kind of pathetic man. I mean, he's just waiting for a reason to snap and kill a bunch of people. He absolutely wants Bradley to stand up for himself and better his life, but that's not really why he's doing all of this. Deep down, I think he actually knows that he is a ruthless killer, and he can't quite come to terms with it. So he ends up taking Bradley on this ridiculous quest just to find some meaning in his bloodlust. This was produced by Blumhouse and put out for streaming on MGM+. I'm glad this movie was able to find a home, but I think you would have heard a lot more about it if it was released on Netflix or on Amazon or even released theatrically. Like, I think that could have worked for the film. I don't know. Every once in a while, I'm just a little confused about the release strategies of some of these Blumhouse movies. Project Wolf Hunting is a South Korean action horror hybrid that kind of feels like the Raid Redemption mixed with Predator, and I know how amazing that pitch sounds, so I'm not gonna overhype this one. I have to be a little careful, because honestly, this was one of my most anticipated films of the year, and it didn't quite live up to those expectations, but I still had a really good time with the film, and I think it's worth watching. It's set in a dystopian future where South Korea takes all of their most violent prisoners and ships them off to the Philippines. On their way there, a bunch of the prisoners start a riot, and from there on out, it turns into this insanely gory action movie. On the lower deck of this ship, there's also some sort of super soldier being transported, and in the chaos of this riot, he gets loose, and the cops and the prisoners have to sort of band together to kill this super soldier because he's just tearing through these people. The story here is kind of nonsensical, but that doesn't really matter because the action and the violence is so entertaining. The film is also quite mean-spirited, which I actually really liked. The prisoners are violent criminals and the cops are crooked, so you never feel too bad about them getting absolutely destroyed by each other. I probably won't be able to show a lot of this movie because the gore is so extreme, and it will definitely turn some people off of the movie, but I think it's so cool. Like, as a horror fan, I think it's so cool that we're getting these really gory movies that go really ham on practical effects still. Like, there's still, a couple of movies every year like this, and I always enjoy them. The Conference is from my home country of Sweden and tells the story of a dysfunctional group of municipal workers at a team-building retreat who are being stalked by a masked killer. This is a horror comedy, which is usually not my genre. I'm not too fond of this stuff, but I ended up really enjoying this film. It's important to note that I, of course, speak Swedish, and I've lived in Sweden all my life, so I understand all of the cultural references in this film. I wanted to say that up front because sometimes comedy doesn't really translate well when you're reading subtitles, but, I have to sort of go off of my own experiences, right? But even so, I think there's a lot to like here. The editing in this film in particular is fantastic. You'll watch someone get their head beaten in with a sledgehammer, and then right before the killer lands their final strike, it'll cut to someone popping open a champagne bottle. The whole movie is kind of tongue-in-cheek like that, and it's very endearing. I also like that they didn't skimp out on the gore, even though it is a horror comedy. I think the gore and the absurd level of violence only add to the charm of the movie. I've seen this film twice so far, and both times I was thoroughly entertained. It's a really solid slasher with some hilarious moments. I also love the mask the killer wears, since it looks pretty goofy in promotion materials, but in the context of the actual film, it's pretty menacing. The Conference is available worldwide on Netflix. My Animal is a coming-of-age werewolf film that immediately drew comparisons to Ginger Snaps. And I get it, because on paper, the movies seem quite similar, but that's really where the similarities end. I think this would actually make a really good double feature with Ginger Snaps, because that film, you have this great bond between these two sisters, and in My Animal, that one is more about isolation, loneliness, feeling like no one in the world could possibly understand what you're going through. We follow Heather, a teenage girl who lives in a very small Canadian town, who also happens to be a werewolf. There's really not much more to the story than that. I mean, it's pretty standard coming-of-age stuff. She meets someone she falls in love with. She's really nervous about trying out for the local hockey team. She argues with her parents. She makes some really dumb mistakes because she's a teenager. That's sort of what you do. What made me fall in love with this film is its sense of style. The direction, cinematography, location, and the score create this amazing sense of time and place. But while having that nostalgic feel that a lot of coming-of-age films do, there's also this looming threat of tragedy that is so important to the werewolf genre. Stephen McHattie also shows up and gives one of his finest performances that I've seen as Heather's father. He's definitely my favorite character of the year. Candyland starts out as one of those grungy teenage wasteland films that were really popular in the 90s and early 2000s, and then it quickly devolves into one of the most brutal slashers I've seen all year. It's about a group of sex workers who are working at a truck stop nicknamed Candyland, and don't worry, the characters themselves aren't actually teenagers, it just has that kind of vibe. Anyways, they end up taking in this new girl who has recently escaped from a religious cult, and in connection with this, someone is picking them off one by one. I'll be the first to admit that this is a strange movie. Where it starts and where it ends feel like two completely different films, and that inconsistency is something I've seen the film be criticized for. But I actually thought it was pretty charming. I'm obviously not trying to spoil anything, but essentially this film turns into a whodunit slasher where the audience actually knows who the killer is. And that's one of those things that sounds like it shouldn't work, but it actually really does here. It's very entertaining. The film looks a little lower budget than some of the other ones on the list, but if you go into it with those expectations, I think you'll have a good time. Venus is a Spanish horror film from one of the co-directors of Wreck. Like Wreck, most of Venus takes place inside of one apartment complex. The main character, Lucia, ends up having to take refuge there after stealing a valuable package from a nightclub she worked at as a dancer. In the background of all of this, some sort of cosmic event is alluded to through news coverage that is shown throughout the film. It sounds a little more complicated than it actually is. Basically, she can't go outside because there's a very real human threat, and inside of the apartment complex, there's something supernatural out to get her. I'm not going to tell you what that is, but as you can tell from the poster, it gets very gory. The third act of this film essentially turns into a supernatural version of The Raid Redemption, where you have all these characters making their way up through this apartment complex, while most of them are being ripped to shreds. It's ridiculously entertaining. Esther Exposito, who plays the lead here, is awesome as Lucia. In a lot of ways, she is your standard badass anti-hero, but there's also a lot of vulnerability on display, which I actually really liked. The reason why she's in this apartment complex is because her sister lives there, and they don't really have a great relationship. There's a scene where her sister is trying to kick her out of the apartment, and she pleads with her that, she has to let her stay. She repeats over and over again that if she gets kicked out in the streets, she will be found and she will be killed. I guess what I'm getting at here is that the emotional core of this movie really worked, and that's really cool when you have a movie like this that is like crazy and gory, but you also connect to it emotionally. Rebirth is in a lot of ways your classic mad scientist story. It's about a mortician who is stealing corpses to reanimate the dead. One of these corpses is the daughter of a nurse that works in the same hospital as her. And from there on out, the two of them create an unlikely partnership as the mother of this child understands that she might be able to get her child back. I will be blunt and say that this is definitely the type of story you've seen before, but what elevates it here is how well made it is. I don't think anyone who's seen a lot of horror is going to be shocked by anything that happens in this film, but if you enjoy these types of has science gone too far stories, you will most likely enjoy this film. An obvious comparison you've probably already thought of is Frankenstein, but I also think there's a fair share of Pet Sematary in here as well, with the grieving parent who's willing to do anything to bring their child back to life. And you as the viewer knows that they're not really doing this for the child. They are doing this to avoid grieving. And it really brings to mind the iconic line from Judd in Pet Sematary, sometimes dead is better. I think I really like the dueling perspectives between the mad scientist and the grieving parent. They do feel like well-rounded characters, so much so that you actually get where both of them are coming from, even as the lines of morality are blurred. The Wrath of Becky took me by surprise a little bit. I was not expecting to enjoy this sequel as much as I did. I like the first film quite a bit, but the team behind this one had not really done anything that I was super impressed with, and on paper, it just kind of seemed like they were doing the same thing again. And don't get me wrong, this sequel certainly doesn't reinvent the wheel, but I did like this actually quite a bit more than the original. Unlike the first one, which is a home invasion movie, in this one, Lulu Wilson, who plays the titular Becky, is out for revenge. She gets attacked, and a person she cares about a lot actually gets killed in connection with that attack, and these people also steal her dog. She realizes that they are part of this alt-right, sort of Proud Boys-esque organization that's led by Sean William Scott. So just like in the original with Kevin James, they have yet again taken an actor that's more known for comedy and put them in this really menacing leader role, which I think is great. If they continue making these movies, I want them to make inspired casting choices like this, because so far they're 2 for 2. Sean William Scott is amazing in this film. If you've seen the original, you're gonna know what to expect here. It's pretty comedic while also being really gory, and it's all tied together with an amazing performance by Lulu Wilson as Becky. I really love what she does with this character, and she's super easy to root for, not only because, she goes up against these neo-Nazis, but also because she's just really fun in this role. And that's it. Those are my 10 hidden gems for the year. I'm going to spend the rest of December catching up on stuff that I've missed, and then at the end of the year, or maybe at the start of next year, I'll do a big long list where I'll rank every horror movie from 2023 that I've seen. I did that with the found footage films, and people seem to like that video, so I'll do it again with everything I've seen this year. It's going to be a little harder because, with found footage films, it's I understand how to rank all of those. Here I'm going to be comparing a lot of different types of subgenres, so it's gonna be a challenge, but I'm looking forward to it. And up until that point, I'm just gonna prepare. I'm gonna try to watch as many movies as I can to make a comprehensive list for you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Is there anything from this year that you really like that you think I should see and include in my list at the end of the year? Please hit me with your comments regarding that stuff. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll talk to you next time.